So I have my profile of the bowl here, and what I'm going to do is I just align, so I'm going to create some geometry out of it a different way. I'm going to create some geometry out of it with a thing called Lathe. So you just pick some curve, some profile curve, and it's going to, as if it were on a lathe, revolve that line around. Now this doesn't quite look like how I expected it. There's several different ways to lathe. First, you can lathe on different axes. All right, well that's again not what I was hoping for. Y is what we had originally. Z is a different one. Whoa, that's definitely not it. So Y is pretty close to what we want, I suppose. But then you have these different ways of aligning. And a lot of times 3D Studio is not going to do it exactly how you expect it in the very beginning, because what 3D Studio thinks of is the the 0 point of your curve, and what you think what you intended for it to be might not quite be on the same page. But it's okay, because 3D Studio allows you, right within the lathe dialog, to align to different different minimums. So it's going to align to one side or the other side, the center of it, which align straight to the center of the shape, which again is not quite right, closer, but then we're going to hit on max. And so 3D Studio thought that this was the minimum, this was the 0 point of the shape, and this was the maximum point of the shape, which is kind of opposite how I thought of it was, but that's because I drew it on a different, drew it sort of backwards. It's okay, it doesn't really matter at the end of the day, because what we have here is the shape that we want. Now, something funky. Look. Something funky about this thing. And why is it all black like this? Well, we had some nice objects before in 3D Studio. Well, that's simply because of a thing called normals. Now, without getting into it too much, we can talk about normals more, but to introduce the idea, normals are simply an individual face has a direction that it points, and if its direction points towards you, then it's going to be shaded nicely. If its direction points away from you, then you're going to see the back side or the unshaded side of the face. So that's what's happening here. Whenever you see anything look too black like this, probably means the normals are inverted. Okay, so we'll keep discussing normals as we see them, but right now, this happens very often when you're creating things. Again, since I drew the curve and on the sort of, I suppose, negative axis I drew it, now it thinks that the normals are inverted. That's okay, because Lathe allows you to flip the normals. And once I hit flip normals, and that comes in how I kind of think it should. All right. Now, another one to turn up is segments. It's a little bit blocky here on the edge. And weld core. Weld core is simply going to take that little sort of nub in the middle of it and weld all those points together, which is a good thing if we want a nice smooth interior of our bowl. We want to take the segments up. Let's say 32. That looks pretty nice. 48 could be a little bit better. Now, if I don't quite like the shape of my bowl, I can always go back to the original line and even turn on show end result. And that original line, I can turn on what's called the sub-object here. We haven't talked about sub-objects yet, but we're going to be using them quite a bit. Now, in our early discussions of sub-objects here, there's several different ways to get to it. You can get to it by clicking the plus sign, kind of like we clicked on the sub-object of our bend modifier from before. You can click on the plus sign and you can enter sub-object mode here. So vertex segment spline. It's simply the maximize this view, simply the components that make up this spline. When we drew the spline, we positioned some vertices. Okay, so these vertices then become a sub-object. Now, different types of object, different classes of objects are going to have different types of sub-objects. And so in the case of a line, they are vertices. Vertices are the really important thing to edit. When you're editing a line, it allows you to edit the shape of that line. Let's turn off display end result. So now we can see our vertices. All right. Now that we have sub-object enabled, you can also get to different sub-objects by hitting 1, 2, and 3 on your keyboard. And those are the same for when we get into 3D objects. You'll have a different set of sub-objects. Okay, so now we can pick individual vertices and go into our move, rotate, scale tools, whatever, and then move parts of this shape around. And so then, if I didn't like the shape of the bowl that I had created, I can simply go in and alter its shape, adjust it, however I feel like it should look. All right. When you're working on a lathe like this, it's really useful to display the end result and then edit it. Okay, so if I go back down to perspective view, I can edit the shape of that line and then see what that's doing to the end result of my bowl there. And I can always at any time turn the display of it on or off. I have something kind of screwy going on here in the interior, and this is where this move gizmo really pays off here, because I know that I can constrain this vertex to move just along this axis. So if I want to refine the shape a little bit, I can constrain the axis of movement to just the one that lies within the same plane of the line, so I don't wreck everything I've done to the bowl, but I can still edit it in perspective view. And I'm not moving it in X in any way, which again could wreck our lathe operation. Okay, so then I can adjust the handles of those Bezier curves to smooth it out a little bit, keep adjusting the handles, move this one around a little bit, and then let's see what it looks like. All right, very good. I think this lipped a little bit much, so we're going to take that down just a touch. And there we go, something like that. Now, if you think a bowl isn't that exciting, well, you got another thing coming, because when you combine that with another type of compound object called a scatter, so I pick my first object, pick scatter, and then you pick the distribution object. So I'm going to go into that mode, pick it, and I sort of snap that little tube onto that object, but then you come down here and you increase the number of duplicates. You can change the way in which it's distributed, sort of more evenly. You can give it a little bit of noise in there if you want to, and then you come down here and change some of the transforms here. So just click on use maximum range, and it's going to give me just some rotations in all those directions. So add a couple more duplicates, and you can very easily spread a bunch of objects over a surface. So when you combine those two objects, my bowl I just made and the macaroni, which is displayed as a box. So if I go to Object Properties and uncheck Display as Box, it'll show up there as well. And some particles and a little bit of lighting. A nice little scene with just some simple objects.